The heart of a medieval marketplace, under the merciless scrutiny of a jeering crowd, stands a wild-eyed young woman with unbroken spirit. They call her savage, untamable, cursed, a creature more animal than human. But as the auctioneer yanks her head back by the hair, exposing her face to potential buyers, something unexpected happens. A cloaked figure emerges from the crowd, silencing the chaos with his mere presence. The king himself, reclusive, embittered, and haunted by loss, raises his hand and claims this worthless savage at a price that leaves the gathering gasping. What drives a grieving monarch to purchase a feral woman whom no one else dares approach? As castle walls close around her, the wild girl discovers a different kind of wilderness, one of deadly court intrigue, poisoned goblets, and whispered conspiracies. While nobles plot and clergymen condemn, an unexpected connection forms between the lonely king and his defiant captive. But beneath the surface lies a shocking truth neither could have imagined, a secret buried in royal blood that will shatter everything they thought they knew about each other. "I am not yours," she declares, spitting at his feet on that first day. The king merely smiles, a disturbing curve of lips that promises both threat and challenge. "We shall see," he replies, unaware that their entwined destinies were written long before either drew breath, and that uncovering the truth might cost them everything. The scent of rotting vegetables and unwashed bodies hung thick in the morning air, a putrid cloud that clung to the back of one's throat. Westborough's market square heaved with activity as merchants barked their offerings, coins clinked against weathered palms, and the occasional shriek of a pig being slaughtered pierced through the cacophony. But today, the usual bustle had taken on a different tone, something darker, hungrier. The crowd pressed forward, faces twisted with a particular kind of anticipation that only emerged when misfortune befell someone else. In the center of the square stood a wooden platform, normally reserved for grain auctions and tax declarations. This morning, however, it displayed a different commodity. A young woman knelt there, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had rubbed her skin raw and bloody. Her hair, a wild, untamed mass of dark tangles, obscured much of her face, but could not hide the defiance that radiated from her like heat from a forge. The auctioneer, a man with yellowed teeth and breath reeking of stale ale, circled her like a predator. "Behold!" he shouted, yanking her head back by the hair so the crowd could see her face. The girl's teeth clenched, but no sound escaped her lips. "The savage wench from the northern woods, found stealing from honest folk and speaking in tongues. They say she was raised by wolves, or perhaps the devil himself." Laughter rippled through the gathering. A woman spat toward the platform, missing but making her contempt known. A child pointed and whispered to his mother, who quickly pulled him away as if proximity alone might contaminate him with whatever curse this wild thing carried. "Starting price is 3 silver coins, the auctioneer announced. "Who will give me 3 silver for this strong back? She might be wild, but she's young, plenty of work left in her bones." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The girl's eyes, a startling, piercing green, scanned the faces before her, not with fear, but with such raw hatred that several men averted their gaze. Her breathing remained steady, almost unnaturally so, as though she were merely waiting like a predator herself. 2 silver, then? The auctioneer's voice held a note of frustration now. "She can be tamed, good folk, just needs a firm hand." A merchant in the front row leaned toward his companion. They found her living in the forest caves, eating raw meat and speaking no Christian tongue. Attacked 3 men before they subdued her. "I heard she killed one," his friend whispered back, the excitement of gossip brightening his dull eyes. The girl's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She understood every word. A disturbance at the edge of the crowd caused heads to turn. The sea of peasants and merchants parted, revealing a small procession of men in polished mail, their crimson cloaks bearing the royal insignia. Whispers spread like wildfire through the gathering. At their center walked a tall figure draped in a black cloak that obscured his features, but the deference shown by the guards confirmed what everyone suspected. King Aldrich himself had come to the market. The crowd fell into a hush so complete that the distant clanging of the blacksmith's hammer seemed thunderous. The king rarely ventured beyond the castle walls since Queen Eleanor's death 3 winters past. His presence at a common auction was unprecedented, alarming even. The auctioneer's face paled, his confidence evaporating as the royal party approached the platform. He attempted a bow so deep he nearly toppled over. "Your Majesty, what an unexpected honor." The king raised a gloved hand, silencing him. He stepped forward, and the hood of his cloak fell back slightly, revealing a face younger than one might expect for a ruler of 15 years, yet lined with the unmistakable marks of grief and solitude. His dark eyes fixed on the kneeling girl who, unlike everyone else in the square, had not lowered her gaze. Instead, she stared directly back at him, as though they were equals. "This is the forest girl I've heard whispers about?" His voice was quiet, yet carried across the silent square. "Yes, sire," the auctioneer stammered. "A wild thing, but strong. Could serve well in the... I'll take her." The king's interruption was soft, but left no room for negotiation. A murmur of shock rippled through the onlookers. The royal chamberlain, a thin man with perpetually worried eyes, leaned close to the king's ear. "Your Majesty, surely you don't need such a creature. The castle has plenty of capable servants who—" "5 gold pieces," King Aldrich stated, ignoring his advisor completely. He held out a small leather pouch that landed with a heavy thud in the auctioneer's trembling hand. 5 gold pieces. It was a fortune for a servant, especially one considered dangerous and unpredictable. The crowd's whispers grew louder, more urgent. What could the king possibly want with this savage girl? The rumors would spread through the kingdom by nightfall. 2 guards moved forward to collect their purchase, roughly hauling the girl to her feet. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Not fear, but the wariness of a cornered animal reassessing its options. "Bring her!" the king commanded, already turning away. As they dragged her past him, something unexpected happened. The girl planted her feet, resisting despite the futility. The sudden movement caught the guards by surprise. She twisted in their grip, and with deliberate precision she spat, not on the ground, but directly before the king's boots. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The guards' hands flew to their sword hilts. Such an insult to the crown was punishable by death on the spot. The girl's voice, when she finally spoke, surprised everyone with its clarity and strength. There was no trace of the animal they had all expected. "I am not yours," she said, each word precise and cutting like a blade. "No man owns me." Time seemed suspended in the market square. The king stood motionless, his expression unreadable behind the shadow of his hood. The guards awaited his command, hands still on their weapons. The crowd held its collective breath, anticipating the swift and merciless justice that would surely follow such brazen defiance. King Aldrich stepped closer to the girl, close enough that only she could hear his next words. Those nearest strained to listen, but caught nothing. What they did see, however, sent a chill through the square. The king's lips curved into a smile, not one of warmth or amusement, but something altogether more disturbing. A smile of challenge accepted. When he straightened and spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the now silent market. "We shall see." The iron chains rattled against stone with each of her footsteps, an announcement of her presence that echoed through Blackmere Castle's cavernous halls. Every servant, every guard, turned to stare as the wild girl was marched through corridors draped with tapestries depicting ancient battles and royal lineages. Their eyes burned into her back, some with curiosity, others with undisguised disgust. Her bare feet left small, damp prints on the polished stone, dirt and blood from the marketplace still caked between her toes. The contrast was jarring, her matted hair and tattered clothes against walls adorned with gold fixtures and velvet hangings. The air inside smelled of beeswax candles and rosemary, so different from the forest scents of pine and soil that had been her only home. Something twisted in her chest, a sensation like drowning on dry land. Each breath of this perfumed air felt like a betrayal to the freedom she'd lost. "Move faster," grunted one of the guards, shoving her forward when she paused to look at a particular tapestry, one showing a woman with flowing golden hair being crowned queen. The guard's fingers dug into her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she memorized his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his right hand twitched toward his sword when she met his eyes. One day, she promised herself, she would remember. They ascended a spiral staircase, up and up until her legs burned with the effort. Finally, they stopped before an ornate door carved with intricate patterns of vines and birds. The chamberlain, the thin, nervous man from the market, stepped forward with a ring of keys. "The king has ordered that you be given accommodations," he said, his voice dripping with disapproval. Though heaven knows why he'd waste such a chamber on. He caught himself, lips pinching tight before finishing with a simple, "On you." The lock turned with a heavy click, and the door swung open to reveal a room that stole her breath despite herself. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting pools of blue and gold across a bed large enough for 5 people. Tapestries covered the walls, and a fire crackled in a stone hearth, banishing the autumn chill. A copper tub stood in one corner, steam rising from its surface, but her attention fixed on one detail that made her stomach clench: the heavy wooden bar on the outside of the door. This was not a chamber, it was a beautiful prison. "You will bathe," the chamberlain instructed, wrinkling his nose at her scent. "Clean clothes have been provided. The king will visit you this evening." He gestured to a young servant girl who stood trembling in the corner, clutching folded garments. "This girl will assist you." The wild girl's jaw tightened. "I need no assistance." "Nevertheless," the chamberlain sniffed, "she will stay. The king insists you be presentable." With that, he and the guards backed out of the room. The heavy door slammed shut, and she heard the bar fall into place with a finality that made her pulse quicken. Alone with the servant, the wild girl circled the room like a caged wolf, testing the windows, sealed with lead and too small, examining the stone walls, no weaknesses, calculating the drop to the courtyard below, deadly. The servant girl watched with wide eyes, pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear into the tapestry. "Well, what shall I call you, miss?" the servant finally whispered. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her name in years. Names were for people who belonged somewhere, who existed in the world of men. She had abandoned hers when she fled to the forest. "Nothing," she replied. "Call me nothing." Hours later, as twilight painted the castle in deepening shadows, the wild girl sat on the edge of the massive bed, uncomfortable in the fine linen shift she'd been forced to wear. Her hair, washed and combed by the terrified servant, hung in damp waves down her back. The dirt had been scrubbed from her skin, revealing old scars and newer bruises. She looked less wild now, but felt more dangerous. A wolf in a silk collar was still a wolf. The bar on the door scraped against wood, and her muscles coiled in instant readiness. When the door swung open, it wasn't the guard or chamberlain, but King Aldrich himself who entered, carrying a wooden tray. The rich scent of fresh bread and roasted meat flooded the room, causing her empty stomach to betray her with a loud growl. The king wore simpler clothes now, a dark tunic and leather breeches, with only a small gold pin at his collar to mark his station. Without the hood shadowing his features, she could see him clearly, younger than she'd thought, perhaps 30 years, with dark hair threaded with premature silver at the temples. His face might have been handsome once, before grief had carved permanent lines around his eyes and mouth. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on a small table. "The castle cook is the finest in 3 kingdoms." She didn't move from her perch on the bed's edge. "I would rather starve than accept your charity." Something flickered across his face, not anger, as she had expected, but something more complex. He pulled a chair closer to the table and sat, breaking off a piece of bread for himself. "It's not charity," he said, chewing slowly. "Consider it payment." "For what?" "For answers." He studied her with unsettling intensity. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "The villagers say you appeared in the northern woods 2 winters ago, living like an animal." She met his gaze without blinking. "And if I refuse to answer?" "Then eat anyway," he replied with a small shrug. "Starving yourself won't earn your freedom. It will only make you weak when an opportunity for escape presents itself." Her eyes narrowed at this unexpected response. Was he acknowledging she would try to flee? Was this some kind of trap? "Why did you buy me?" she demanded instead of answering his questions. A king has no need for one more servant, especially one who promises nothing but trouble. A bitter smile touched his lips. Perhaps I've grown tired of being surrounded by people who only tell me what they think I wish to hear. Perhaps a bit of honest hatred is refreshing. The wild girl felt off balance, wrong-footed by this conversation. She had expected threats, demands, perhaps even violence, not this strange, quiet exchange that bordered on respect. As the silence stretched between them, the wind outside grew stronger, howling around the castle's towers like a living thing. It reminded her of the forest, of freedom, and something in her chest ached with such sudden sharpness that she had to clench her fists to keep from showing pain. "The north tower has a loose stone in the third window embrasure," the king said abruptly, rising from his chair. "The drop to the inner wall is 15 feet, dangerous but survivable. The guards change at midnight, leaving a gap of approximately 1 minute. The kitchens have a delivery entrance that is poorly watched." Her mouth fell open in shock before she could control her expression. "Why are you telling me this?" He moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the latch. "Because I want you to understand something. If you escape tonight, and you could, you would be hunted. Not just by my men, but by villagers eager for reward, by bandits who would sell you to worse men than me, by a world that has already decided what you are." His eyes held hers, and something in them made her throat tighten. "Or you could stay, and perhaps discover who I am, who you might be, beyond survival." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closed behind him. But, she realized with a jolt of surprise, she didn't hear the bar fall into place. That night, as moonlight spilled through the stained glass, casting eerie patterns across the stone floor, she crept to the door and pressed her palm against it. It swung open silently. The corridor beyond lay empty and dark. Freedom beckoned. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she took one step forward, then another. The familiar urge to run, to disappear into the night, surged through her veins like wildfire. But at the junction where the corridor split, one path leading down toward potential escape, the other continuing deeper into the castle, she found herself hesitating, the king's words echoing in her mind. "If you escape tonight, and you could, you would be hunted." Her hand drifted to the wall for support, fingers brushing against cold stone as an unwelcome thought surfaced. What if this, too, was a test? The weight of 1,000 eyes pierced her skin like needles as she stood beside the king's throne. The great hall of Blackmere Castle blazed with the light of 100 golden candelabras, their flames dancing across jeweled goblets and polished silver plates. The wild girl, now draped in emerald silk that made her eyes appear unnaturally bright, felt her lungs constrict with each breath of the incense-heavy air. The dress they'd forced her into squeezed her ribs like a predator's jaws, the unfamiliar sensation of slippers on her feet making her feel as though she walked on shifting sand. "Smile," King Aldrich murmured from the corner of his mouth, his own expression a practiced mask of regal indifference. "They expect you to cower, disappoint them." She didn't smile. Instead, she lifted her chin a fraction higher, meeting the stunned and horrified stares of the assembled nobility with the same unflinching gaze she'd once used to face down wolves in the dead of winter. The silk of her gown rustled as she shifted her weight, the sound reminding her of leaves before a storm, a warning of danger that made her shoulder blades tighten with instinctive readiness. The feast had been announced that morning, a grand banquet to honor the Duke of Westerly's arrival. But she wasn't fooled. This display, her presence beside the throne like some exotic trophy, was the king's true purpose. Was it a test? A punishment? Or something else entirely? The uncertainty made her stomach knot, even as she kept her face impassive. "The savage has been tamed, it seems," remarked a heavy-set baron seated nearest the dais, his voice pitched just loud enough to be heard. A smirk twisted his fleshy lips as he raised his goblet in mock salute. "Though one wonders if your majesty's unusual pet might still bite when provoked." Several nearby nobles chuckled, the sound slithering across the hall like something venomous. The wild girl felt rather than saw the king tense beside her, the slight stiffening of his shoulders betraying the anger he wouldn't show. His fingers tightened imperceptibly around the stem of his goblet, a detail only she, standing so close, could perceive. "Lord Harwick," the king replied, his voice deceptively light. I've found that those who speak most of biting are often the ones who've never felt real teeth. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps you would care to test your theory? The laughter died. Lord Harwick's face flushed crimson, the veins in his thick neck bulging as he struggled to determine if he'd been threatened. Before he could respond, servants appeared with the first course, roasted pheasant glazed with honey and herbs, the aroma momentarily distracting the tense gathering. The wild girl stared at the food placed before her, its arrangement too perfect, too deliberate, nothing like the honest simplicity of a freshly caught rabbit or foraged berries. She made no move to touch it, nor the silver knife and fork that lay beside the plate like strange weapons. The memory of hunger was an old friend. She would not betray it for this display of excess. "You dishonor our hospitality," hissed the woman seated to the king's left. Lady Marianne, the king's sister-in-law and widow to his elder brother. Her beauty was the cold, hard kind that reminded the wild girl of frost-covered stone. "At least pretend to be grateful for the charity shown to your kind." The wild girl met Lady Marianne's gaze directly, a breach of etiquette that caused several nearby courtiers to inhale sharply. "I have seen wolves show more honest hospitality," she replied, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "At least they don't disguise their hunger behind smiles." The hall froze. Forks paused midway to mouths. A servant nearly dropped a platter of bread, catching it at the last moment with trembling hands. The tension coiled tighter than a serpent ready to strike. Lady Marianne's perfect features contorted with rage. "How dare this animal speak to me this way? Your Majesty, I demand—" "You demand nothing in my hall," King Aldrich cut in, his voice quiet but edged with steel. The wild girl saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger at her outburst, but something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if she had performed exactly as he'd hoped. The realization sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. He raised his goblet, the ruby wine catching the candlelight like fresh blood. "To honesty," he proclaimed, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of his court. "A rare and precious commodity, wouldn't you agree?" After a moment's hesitation, the nobles raised their own cups in a confused toast. The wild girl remained motionless, watching as the king took a deliberate sip, then turned to her with a subtle nod that seemed to say, "Well done." She felt suddenly unbalanced, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She had expected punishment for her insolence, not approval. What game was this man playing? And more disturbing still, why did she feel an unwanted flicker of satisfaction at having pleased him? The feast dragged on for hours, course after course of rich foods that made her stomach turn with their excess. The conversation around her ebbed and flowed like a treacherous tide. Honeyed compliments carrying barbed insults, alliances forming and dissolving between bites of suckling pig and sweetened custard. She observed it all with growing clarity. This was another kind of wilderness, with its own predators and prey, its own laws of survival. "They fear you," the king murmured during a moment when the musicians played loudly enough to cover their words. "Not because you're wild, but because you're free in ways they can never be." Before she could respond, a commotion near the hall's entrance drew all eyes. A slender man with a face as sharp as a blade strode in, his black robes marking him as clergy, the heavy silver cross at his chest identifying his high rank. The assembled nobles fell silent, many bowing their heads respectfully as he approached the dais. "Bishop Thornfeld," the king acknowledged, his tone carefully neutral. "We did not expect your presence tonight." The bishop's cold gaze fixed on the wild girl with such intense loathing that she felt it like a physical blow. "Clearly not, Your Majesty. Had I known you would display such impropriety at your table, I might have spared myself the disappointment." A muscle twitched in the king's jaw. "Speak plainly, Bishop. What brings you to my feast uninvited?" "God's work requires no invitation," Thornfeld replied, his thin lips barely moving. "I come with concerns from the Holy Church regarding rumors that have reached even our humble abbey. Rumors of a wild woman, a heathen, given a place of honor beside the throne." The wild girl felt the weight of every stare in the hall pressing against her skin. Something primitive and fierce rose in her chest, the same feeling that had kept her alive in the forest when wolves circled her campfire. She would not cower before this man and his invisible god. "If your god fears a woman in a borrowed dress," she said before she could stop herself, "then perhaps he is not as powerful as you claim." And gasps erupted throughout the hall. Lady Marianne pressed a hand to her throat as if about to faint. The bishop's face contorted with such hatred that spittle gathered at the corners of his mouth. "Blasphemy," he hissed. "This confirms what I feared. This creature has bewitched you, sire. The church cannot stand idle while pagan influence corrupts the crown." King Aldrich rose slowly from his throne, his expression unreadable. The wild girl braced herself for rejection, for him to disavow her words and placate the furious clergyman. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture so unexpected that she nearly flinched away. "Bishop," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent hall, "you mistake honesty for blasphemy, a common error among those who traffic primarily in the latter." The tension in the hall crackled like lightning before a storm. Nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain where to place their loyalty in this dangerous moment. The bishop's pale eyes narrowed to slits, his hands tightening around his silver cross until his knuckles whitened. "You tread a dangerous path, Your Majesty," he warned, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried farther than a shout. "The Church has guided this kingdom through darker times than these. Kings come and go, but God's authority remains eternal." The threat hung in the air between them, naked and undisguised. The wild girl felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her instincts screaming of danger more deadly than any forest predator. This man with his cross and his robes carried a different kind of power, one that could turn the entire kingdom against them with a few carefully chosen words. As the bishop turned to leave, his black robe sweeping dramatically across the stone floor, a servant rushed forward, leaning close to whisper urgently in the king's ear. The wild girl, standing near enough to overhear, caught fragments. "Message delivered to her chambers," and "warning of danger." The king's face betrayed nothing, but she felt the subtle tensing of his body, saw the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. Without explanation, he announced the feast's conclusion, dismissing the confused and murmuring nobility with practiced grace. Later that night, when the castle had grown quiet and moonlight spilled through her chamber windows, the wild girl discovered a small folded parchment that had been slipped beneath her door. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, the single sentence written in a hurried hand sending ice through her veins. "Someone wants you dead. Blood." The metallic scent hit her before her eyes found its source, a thin crimson line trickling from beneath her chamber door, seeping between ancient stones. The wild girl's fingers closed around the dagger she'd discovered under her mattress hours earlier, its weight unfamiliar yet comforting in her palm. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped animal as she approached the door, every muscle coiled tight with anticipation. One breath. Two. She yanked it open. A dead raven lay sprawled on the threshold, its glossy feathers slick with still warm blood. A thin cord of braided silk wrapped around its broken neck. Pinned to its breast with a silver needle was a scrap of parchment bearing a single word: "Next." The wild girl's throat constricted as she scanned the empty corridor, the back of her neck prickling with the certainty of being watched. Whoever had left this warning was still close, perhaps close enough to hear her rapid breathing, to sense the fear she refused to show. She crouched to examine the bird, careful to touch nothing. Its eyes remained open, glassy beads reflecting the torchlight. This was no random act of cruelty. Ravens were messengers, carriers of secrets. The message here was unmistakable: silence or death. But who had sent it? Bishop Thornfeld with his ice-cold gaze? Lady Marianne and her whispered conspiracies? Or someone else entirely, watching from the shadows of this labyrinthine castle where every tapestry might hide a listener, every servant a potential spy? The sound of approaching footsteps sent her retreating into her chamber, the bloody dagger concealed in the folds of her nightdress. She kicked the dead raven inside and shut the door just as two guards rounded the corner, their mail shirts jingling softly with each step. Through the keyhole, She watched them pass, their faces betraying nothing but the boredom of men assigned to midnight patrol. When their footfalls faded, she exhaled the breath she'd been holding, her lungs burning with relief. The dagger went beneath her pillow, the dead raven wrapped in a scrap of cloth and hidden in the empty chest at the foot of her bed. Evidence, should she need it. Though who would believe the word of a savage against that of nobility? In the forest, danger announced itself honestly. The snarl of a wolf, the rustle of a boar charging through underbrush. Here in this stone prison of silks and secrets, death wore 1,000 disguised faces, each more treacherous than the last. Sleep evaded her that night. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind against the window shutters jerked her back to alertness. By the time dawn's pale fingers stretched across the eastern sky, her eyes burned with exhaustion, her body humming with the strange energy that comes from fear sustained too long. A soft knock at her door sent her hand flying to the dagger. "Enter," she called, voice steadier than she felt. It was the king himself who stepped inside, his appearance a shock in the gray morning light. Gone was the regal bearing, the carefully constructed mask of authority. His face looked haggard, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he too had passed a sleepless night. He wore a simple tunic of undyed wool, belted at the waist with leather, the clothes of a common man, not a monarch. "You received a warning," he said without preamble, his gaze immediately finding the faint blood stain on the floor she hadn't fully scrubbed away. She didn't bother denying it. "A dead raven, and this." She withdrew the dagger from beneath her pillow, its blade catching the dawn light. The king's expression darkened as he took the weapon, turning it over in his hands. His thumb traced a small insignia etched into the hilt, a falcon with outstretched wings. "This belongs to Sir Reginald, captain of Lady Marianne's personal guard." His voice dropped to a murmur. "The plot thickens." "Why would they want me dead?" she asked, watching his face carefully for any sign of deception. "I am nothing, no one." A bitter smile touched his lips. "You are something they fear more than death itself. Unknown. A variable they cannot control." He returned the dagger to her, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture that seemed almost deliberate. "Keep this close. You may need it sooner than either of us would wish." The wild girl slipped the blade back into hiding, unsettled by his words, by his presence in her chamber, by the strange intimacy of conspiracy. "Why do you care if I live or die? I am your property, nothing more." Something flashed in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger. "Is that what you believe?" "It's what you made me," she countered, lifting her chin in defiance. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the cedar and clove scent that clung to his clothes, could see the faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "I bought your freedom, not your person. There's a difference." Pretty words from the man who keeps me locked in a tower. "The door has been unlocked since your first night," he reminded her, his voice soft but intense. "You chose to stay." The truth of his statement hit her like a physical blow. She had chosen this gilded cage over the uncertain freedom beyond the castle walls. Why? The question haunted her, made her stomach clench with something like shame. Before she could respond, he turned toward the window, gazing out at the kingdom awakening below. "I was married once," he said, the abrupt change of subject catching her off guard. "Eleanor was her name. She was everything I was not. Kind where I was harsh, gentle where I was unyielding." His voice took on a hollow quality that made the hair on the wild girl's arms rise. "She died in childbirth. The babe, too, 3 winters ago." The raw pain in his words hung between them, heavy as a physical presence. The wild girl remained silent, uncertain why he shared this most intimate grief with her, of all people. "After her death I discovered letters," he continued, still facing away. "Correspondence suggesting she had been helped to her grave. Subtle poisons administered over months, weakening her before the birth." His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening. "I have never found proof, never discovered who wanted her dead. But I have my suspicions." He turned back to her then, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. The same people who now want you eliminated. Why tell me this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I need someone I can trust, he replied simply. And in a court built on lies, your honesty, however brutal, is the only currency I value. Trust. The word felt foreign, dangerous. In the forest, trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. Yet something in his gaze, in the unguarded pain he'd revealed, resonated within her like the memory of a song long forgotten. I will move you to chambers nearer my own, he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. For your protection. My personal guards will watch your door. Protection. Another foreign concept. She had protected herself for years, had needed no one. The thought of depending on another, on him, made her chest tighten with a mixture of resentment and something more complex she couldn't name. That evening, as servants transferred her few possessions to a new chamber in the royal wing, the wild girl stood on a balcony overlooking the castle courtyard. Torches illuminated guards at their posts, servants hurrying to complete final tasks before night fully descended. The vastness of the world beyond the castle walls called to her like an old friend. The dark forest visible in the distance, the star-scattered sky that had been her roof for so long. A flicker of movement in the shadows below caught her attention. A cloaked figure slipped between pools of torchlight, moving with deliberate stealth toward the eastern gate. The figure paused, glancing up, and for the briefest moment, moonlight illuminated the face beneath the hood, Lady Marianne, her perfect features set in lines of grim determination. In her hand glinted something small and metallic, a key. The wild girl stepped back from the balcony's edge, her mind racing. Where would the king's sister-in-law go at this hour, alone and in secret? And why? The memory of the dead raven flashed through her thoughts, its silent warning echoing in her bones. Later that night, as she lay in her new bed listening to the muffled footsteps of guards patrolling the corridor outside, the king's words replayed in her mind. I need someone I can trust. Trust required vulnerability. Vulnerability meant danger. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, one unsettling question remained. What terrified her more? The nameless assassins lurking in the shadows, or the realization that, for the first time since fleeing to the forest, she was no longer entirely alone. A hand clamped over her mouth, jerking her from sleep. Hot breath against her ear. Don't scream. Incense hung thick in the cathedral air, sweet and suffocating, like breathing through honey laced with poison. The wild girl's throat closed against it, her body rejecting this artificial scent so unlike the honest aromas of earth and pine she'd known in the forest. Morning light filtered through stained glass, fracturing into shards of ruby, sapphire, and emerald that fell across stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of penitent knees. The effect should have been beautiful, but to her, it felt like drowning in colored shadows, each breath more labored than the last. "Kneel!" hissed the guard at her back, his mailed fist pressing between her shoulder blades. The pressure sent a bolt of pain down her spine, but she remained standing, legs locked in defiance. Last night's intruder, not an assassin as she'd feared, but a royal messenger, had delivered her to this moment. A summons before the church council. A trial in all but name. Bishop Thornfeld sat centered on a raised dais, flanked by 6 lesser clergymen whose hooded faces remained in shadow. Before them a crowd had gathered, nobles, servants, merchants, all crammed into wooden pews, their collective breath adding to the stifling atmosphere. The wild girl scanned their faces, finding no allies, only curiosity and contempt in equal measure. She spotted Lady Marianne in the front row, her perfect features arranged in an expression of pious concern that didn't reach her cold eyes. The accused will kneel before God's representatives, Bishop Thornfeld repeated, his thin voice slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. The wild girl's jaw tightened. I kneel to no man who claims to speak for gods I do not worship. A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral. The guard's grip on her shoulder tightened painfully, fingers digging into flesh through the simple linen dress they'd forced her to wear. White, the color of innocence, a mockery of what they all believed her to be. Her eyes found the king, seated to the side of the proceedings rather than at their center. His face betrayed nothing, the mask of royalty firmly in place, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped the arms of his chair. The wild girl felt a strange twist in her chest at the sight. Was it anger at his apparent abandonment, or something more complex? He had warned her last night, his voice low and urgent in her ear. Answer nothing. Admit nothing. This is a trap, not a trial. Bishop Thornfeld rose, the movement deliberate and theatrical. His crimson robes caught the colored light, making him appear as though he were bathed in blood. We gather today to address a matter of grave spiritual concern, he announced, his reedy voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. The woman who stands before us, this wild creature, has been allowed to pollute the sacred halls of our kingdom with her heathen presence. He paused, pale eyes fixing on her with the cold hatred of a snake. She has bewitched our king, turned his ear from godly counsel, and threatened the very soul of our nation with her ungodly influence. The wild girl's pulse quickened, blood rushing in her ears. Bewitched. The absurdity of it might have made her laugh if the danger weren't so real. She had seen what happened to women accused of witchcraft in the villages near her forest, had smelled their burning flesh, had heard their screams carried on the wind. I have done nothing, she stated, her voice steadier than she felt. Silence! Thornfeld slammed his palm against the wooden lectern. You speak only when questioned directly, woman. A muscle twitched in her jaw, but she held her tongue, measuring the distance to the nearest exit, calculating her chances. 4 guards at the main door, 2 more flanking the altar, and the one still gripping her shoulder. Too many, even if she could somehow reach the dagger strapped to her thigh beneath the white dress. We have witnesses, the bishop continued, who attest to your unnatural behaviors, to your corruption of His Majesty's judgment through methods both carnal and supernatural. The accusation hung in the air like poison. The wild girl's eyes darted to the king, whose expression remained carved from stone, though a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. Bring forth the first witness, Thornfeld commanded. A servant girl stepped forward, the same timid creature who had helped bathe the wild girl on her first night in the castle. Her hands twisted nervously in her apron as she curtsied to the clergy. Tell us what you observed, the bishop prompted. The girl's voice trembled. She speaks to herself in strange tongues, Your Eminence. I've heard her through the door, and she keeps strange objects, feathers and bones, beneath her mattress. Trinkets from the forest, treasures that connected her to the freedom she'd lost. The wild girl's throat tightened with a surge of unexpected grief. And did you witness any interactions between this woman and His Majesty that seemed inappropriate? Thornfeld leaned forward, his thin lips wet with anticipation. The servant hesitated, glancing fearfully toward the king. The truth, child, for your immortal soul. They speak in whispers, the girl finally blurted, tears gathering in her eyes. And once I saw her with a dagger, the kind a lady should never touch. More witnesses followed. A stable boy who claimed he'd seen her collecting strange herbs in the royal garden, a cook who swore she'd refused to eat blessed food, a guard who reported hearing laughter from the king's chambers late at night when she was summoned there. Each testimony more twisted than the last, truth warped into something sinister. The wild girl felt cold sweat gathering at the nape of her neck, trickling down her spine like icy fingers. This was no trial, but an execution in slow motion, each word another stone in what would become her tomb. These testimonies paint a disturbing picture, Bishop Thornfeld declared, turning to address the crowd rather than her. A heathen woman, plucked from the wilderness, now whispering poison into our sovereign's ear. What protection have we against such insidious corruption? The wild girl's patience snapped like a bowstring pulled too tight. You speak of corruption? Her voice cut through the cathedral, bouncing off stone and glass. I have seen your kind before. Men who use invisible gods to mask very visible greed. The crowd erupted, some gasping in horror, others leaning forward with widened eyes. Bishop Thornfeld's face flushed crimson, his composure fracturing for the first time. You dare! I dare speak truth, she continued, stepping forward despite the guard's attempt to restrain her. I fear no man's judgment, least of all yours. I am flesh and blood, as is every person here. The only difference is that I do not bow my head to lies." Her words echoed in the sudden silence. For a heartbeat, she saw uncertainty flicker across some faces in the crowd. A seed of doubt planted where blind faith had ruled. The bishop recovered quickly, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. And here we see the devil's silver tongue at work. How eloquently evil speaks when cornered. He turned to the assembled nobles. "This is precisely why such creatures must be expelled from our midst before their poison spreads." From the corner of her eye, the wild girl saw the king shift in his seat, his hand moving subtly toward the sword at his hip. But before he could speak or act, Bishop Thornfeld delivered his verdict. "By the authority vested in me by God and the Holy Church, I declare this woman unfit to dwell among God-fearing Christians. She will be removed from the castle immediately and delivered to the people for judgment, as is our ancient custom with those who bring corruption to our shores." Delivered to the people. The wild girl knew what that meant. She would be returned to the marketplace where the king had first found her, but this time not for sale. This time, for public punishment, perhaps even death. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear. King Aldrich rose then, his movement drawing all eyes. "The church oversteps its bounds," he stated, his voice level but edged with steel. "This woman is under royal protection and will remain so until I decree otherwise." The tension between king and bishop crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Two powers, equally matched, circling each other with bared teeth disguised as smiles. "Even kings must answer to God's law," Thornfeld replied softly. "Unless your majesty wishes to sever ties with the church entirely? A dangerous prospect, given how the people value their faith." It was a checkmate move, a thinly veiled threat of excommunication, which could turn the entire kingdom against the crown. The wild girl watched understanding dawn on the king's face, followed by something that looked like resignation. Her chest tightened with an unexpected pang. Had he finally decided she wasn't worth the risk? That night, as she was confined to her chambers under double guard, the wild girl paced like a caged animal, the bishop's sentence echoing in her mind. Tomorrow at dawn she would be cast out, handed over to a mob whose minds had been poisoned against her. She had survived the forest, had outwitted wolves and bears. But how could she fight an entire kingdom's hatred? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. When she didn't answer, it opened anyway, revealing the king. He entered alone, without guards or witnesses, closing the door quietly behind him. In the firelight, his face looked older, lined with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "I have failed you," he said simply. The admission caught her off guard. "You owe me nothing. I brought you here. I put you in danger." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "But I will not abandon you to Thornfeld's justice." Her heart skipped a beat, hope and suspicion warring within her. "What can you do?" "Your hands are tied." His voice dropped to a whisper, forcing her to lean closer. "If I must choose between my crown and saving you." He hesitated, something raw and unexpected flickering across his face. "I'm no longer certain I know how to choose." The yellowed parchment burned her fingertips, not with heat, but with the weight of its secrets. The wild girl stared at the elegant script, her throat constricting, as each word unraveled everything she thought she knew. Dawn light filtered through the arrow-slit window of the hidden passage where she now crouched, casting just enough illumination to read the letter she'd discovered tucked beneath her mattress during the frantic minutes before guards arrived to escort her to judgment. "My beloved husband," it began in a delicate hand. "If you are reading this, I have left this world as I feared I might. Do not trust those closest to you. The wine they bring carries more than just comfort. It carries my death in slow sips. They watch you even now. Trust no one but yourself. My love always, Eleanor." The dead queen's final warning, hidden for 3 years, now found by a wild girl who should never have been in the castle at all. The coincidence felt too precise to be accident, too calculated to be fate. Who had placed it there? Why now? Her pulse hammered in her ears as she carefully refolded the letter, tucking it into the hidden pocket she'd sewn into her simple dress. The one concession the guards had allowed her to keep from her forest days, the ability to hide small treasures against her skin. A single drop of sweat trickled down her spine, despite the chamber's chill. The secret passage, shown to her by the king himself in hurried whispers the night before, wound through the castle's ancient stones like a serpent, connecting her chambers to his through a labyrinth of forgotten corridors. "Use this tomorrow," he had murmured, his fingers lingering on the latch. "When they come for you, I will find you here." But dawn had broken hours ago, and still she waited alone, the stone walls pressing closer with each passing moment, the air growing thinner with each anxious breath. Footsteps echoed in the main corridor beyond her hiding place, the measured tread of guards searching room by room. They would find her empty chamber soon, sound the alarm. The hunt would begin in earnest, her muscles coiled with the instinct to flee, a rabbit sensing the hawk's shadow. But where? The king had not come as promised. Had he abandoned her after all? Or worse, had he been discovered, his protection of her revealed as treason against the church? She forced herself deeper into the passage, each step carrying her farther from the safety of familiar territory. Cobwebs clung to her hair and face, the taste of ancient dust coating her tongue. The darkness ahead seemed absolute, a physical presence pushing against her outstretched hands. Yet she pressed on, guided by the memory of freedom, by the determination that had kept her alive in the forest when winter seemed endless and food scarce as mercy. The passage curved unexpectedly, then split into 3 branches. Which way? Her heart stuttered with indecision, precious seconds bleeding away, as distant shouts confirmed her escape had been discovered. She closed her eyes, willing her breathing to slow, reaching out with senses honed by years of survival. The faintest whisper of fresher air brushed her left cheek. The middle passage, then. Without hesitation, she plunged forward, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall, the other clutching the dagger she'd kept hidden since the night of the warning. The darkness swallowed her whole, a living thing that pressed against her eyes and filled her lungs. How long had she been walking? Minutes? Hours? Time lost meaning in this lightless labyrinth. Just as panic began to claw at her throat, her questing fingers found something unexpected, the smooth grain of wood rather than stone. A door. She pressed her ear against it, straining to hear any sound from the other side. Nothing. With painstaking care, she eased it open a fraction, then froze as hinges creaked in protest. When no alarm sounded, she peered through the narrow gap and found herself looking into what appeared to be a private study. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents more wealth than most villagers would see in a lifetime. A massive oak desk dominated the center, its surface covered with maps and documents weighted down by a silver dagger that gleamed in the light from a single window. Empty. She slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. Whose chambers were these? Not the king's. She'd glimpsed his quarters once, and they had been Spartanly furnished, more soldier than sovereign. These belonged to someone who valued knowledge, who collected secrets like precious gems. Her gaze fell on a document half hidden beneath others on the desk, the royal seal broken but still visible on red wax. Unable to resist, she moved closer, scanning the first lines. Her blood turned to ice. It was a decree, already signed with the king's name, though something about the signature struck her as wrong, ordering her immediate execution for treason and witchcraft. Not exile as Bishop Thornfeld had proclaimed, but death. The date marked was yesterday's. A lie, then. The king's promise of protection, his secret passage, the intimate confession that had made her treacherous heart flutter, all fabrications designed to keep her compliant until the executioner's blade was sharpened. Bile rose in her throat, bitter as betrayal. She had begun to trust, had started to believe. The study door swung open without warning. The wild girl dropped instinctively into a defensive crouch, dagger raised, only to find herself facing not guards but Lady Marianne, whose perfect features contorted with shock before settling into a cold smile. "The fox finds herself in the henhouse," Lady Marianne said softly. closing the door behind her. Her eyes, blue as midwinter ice, fell on the dagger in the wild girl's hand without a trace of fear. How convenient. I was just thinking I should find you before the guards do. You! The wild girl hissed, connecting fragments that suddenly formed a clear picture. You killed the queen. Something flickered across Lady Marianne's face, surprise perhaps, that this savage creature had pieced together what the entire court had missed. She recovered quickly, her smile returning sharper than before. Eleanor was weak, she replied with a dismissive wave. Too gentle for the throne, too trusting for survival. Aldrich deserved a stronger queen. She took a step closer, her silk skirts whispering against the stone floor. One who understands power. You poisoned her, your own sister. The wild girl's grip on her dagger tightened, knuckles whitening. Lady Marianne laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Half-sister, a distinction that matters when bloodlines determine kingdoms. Her gaze hardened. But how would you know that? Unless... Her eyes narrowed, studying the wild girl's face with new intensity. Those eyes. I should have seen it sooner. Something in her tone sent a chill down the wild girl's spine. Seen what? Eleanor had a child before she married Aldrich. A daughter, born of youthful indiscretion with a northern lord. The babe was sent away, supposedly to die of exposure in the winter woods. Lady Marianne circled slowly, a predator assessing its prey. But clearly someone found her, raised her wild, far from court intrigue. How poetic that you should return now, like a ghost rising to accuse me. The words struck like physical blows, each one shattering something fundamental in the wild girl's understanding of herself. A daughter of the queen, royal blood flowing through the veins of a forest savage? Impossible. Yet even as her mind rejected it, something deeper recognized truth in the revelation, explaining the strange sense of familiarity she'd felt in the castle corridors, the dreams of gilded halls that had haunted her sleep since childhood. You're lying, she managed, though uncertainty made her voice waver. Am I? Lady Marianne moved to a small cabinet, withdrawing a handheld mirror of polished silver. She held it up, forcing the wild girl to see her own reflection alongside Marianne's. Look at our eyes, the same shape, though yours are green like your mother's, the same high cheekbones, the same stubborn chin. Blood always tells, niece. The wild girl stared, transfixed by the undeniable similarities now pointed out. Her entire body trembled with the force of this revelation, memories she'd thought long buried surfacing like stones after a flood, fragments of lullabies, the scent of lavender, gentle hands smoothing her hair. Why show me this now? She demanded, struggling to keep her voice steady. Lady Marianne's smile was a blade in moonlight. Because dead women tell no tales, and you'll be joining your mother very soon. From within her sleeve, she produced a thin silver needle, its tip glistening with something that was not water. The same poison that took Eleanor. Fitting, don't you think? The wild girl backed away, dagger raised, but found herself trapped against the desk. The king will know. He'll discover what you've done. Aldrich sees only what he wishes to see, Lady Marianne replied, advancing with measured steps. And after your tragic death while attempting escape, by your own hand, driven mad by the church's accusations, he'll need comfort, a strong shoulder to lean on, a new queen, perhaps. Understanding bloomed like blood in water. This had been the plan all along. The wild girl was merely a pawn in a game that had begun years before her arrival, a convenient distraction while larger pieces moved into position. The letter she'd found hadn't been meant for her at all. It had been planted as evidence to be discovered after her death, pointing to suicide rather than murder. As Lady Marianne lunged forward, needle aimed at her throat, the wild girl's forest instincts took over. She ducked and rolled, sending papers flying from the desk, coming up behind her attacker with the fluid grace of a predator. Before Marianne could turn, the wild girl had her own dagger pressed against the older woman's throat, the cold steel kissing skin like a lover. Give me one reason not to cut your throat, she whispered, her voice rough with rage. A pounding at the study door interrupted whatever answer might have come. Lady Marianne, a guard's voice called urgently. The king demands your presence immediately. The savage girl has escaped." In that moment's distraction, Marianne twisted free, bringing the silver needle around in a vicious arc. The wild girl jerked backward, but not quickly enough. Fire bloomed across her forearm where the needle had scored a thin red line. Poison. Already she could feel it spreading, a cold numbness replacing the burning pain. "Too late," Marianne whispered, triumph gleaming in her eyes. "Even a scratch is enough. By sunset, you'll be nothing but a memory, a wild thing that should never have been tamed." The study door burst open, guards flooding in with swords drawn. The wild girl knew she had only seconds before the poison slowed her reflexes, before escape became impossible. With a desperate surge of strength, she lunged for the window, crashing through ancient glass as shouts and curses erupted behind her. The fall seemed endless, time stretching like honey as she plummeted toward the castle courtyard below. Just before impact, a flash of memory, not her own, but perhaps her mother's. A baby girl, wrapped in fine linen, green eyes wide with wonder, being handed to a trusted servant with whispered instructions to hide her, save her, give her a chance at life far from court intrigue. Then darkness. Death should have claimed her, but instead, pain greeted her awakening. Raw, merciless pain that set every nerve ending ablaze. The wild girl's eyes fluttered open to darkness, her lungs struggling for air that tasted of earth and decay. A crypt. They had buried her alive. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried to move, only to discover her limbs were bound not by shrouds, but by bandages soaked through with something sticky and pungent. Not a tomb, then. But where? "Be still," a voice commanded from the shadows. "The poison still flows in your veins. Movement will only hasten its path to your heart." Her vision swam, shapes blurring and reforming in the dim light of a single oil lamp. Gradually, stone walls came into focus, rough-hewn, dripping with moisture, nothing like the polished grandeur of Blackmere Castle. The scent of herbs and tallow filled her nostrils, mingling with the metallic tang of her own blood. She was underground, that much was certain. In some hidden chamber beneath the castle, perhaps, or beyond its walls entirely. "Who?" Her voice emerged as a ragged whisper, her throat raw as though she'd been screaming. A figure moved closer, features materializing from darkness. An old woman with skin like cracked leather and eyes clouded by cataracts. Her gnarled hands worked methodically, grinding something in a wooden mortar. "Names matter little now," the crone replied. "You may call me what others do, the Witch of the Hollow." The wild girl's pulse quickened. She knew that name, whispered in forest clearings, invoked in curses and prayers alike by villagers who feared the old woman's power while secretly seeking her remedies. A hedge witch, exiled from society yet bound to it by need and superstition, not unlike herself. "Lady Marianne's poison," the girl managed. "How did you extract it?" The old woman's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "I didn't. The poison remains inside you, girl. I've merely convinced it to sleep for a while." She leaned closer, her breath smelling of mint and something sharper, less natural. "But it will wake soon enough. And when it does, your heart will stop beating before you can draw breath to scream." Cold dread pooled in the wild girl's stomach. "There's no cure?" The witch's silence was answer enough. She turned away, busying herself with bottles and bundles of dried plants hanging from the low ceiling. "There are those who would call your death a mercy," she said finally. "The king's men search every corner of the kingdom for you. The bishop has declared you a demon in human form. Villages burn effigies with your face." She paused, and Lady Marianne sits ever closer to the throne, whispering in Aldrich's grief-stricken ear. The wild girl's fists clenched beneath their bandages. "He believes I'm dead. A body was found in the courtyard where you fell." A servant girl with similar build, her face conveniently destroyed beyond recognition in the fall. The witch's cloudy eyes seemed to pierce through darkness. Convenient for some, at least. Horror twisted the wild girl's gut. Another innocent dead in this deadly game of thrones. How many more would fall before it ended? "Why save me?" she demanded, struggling to sit upright despite the fire that raced through her veins with the movement. What do you gain? The old woman was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. I delivered you into this world, she said finally. On a night when winter howled like a wounded beast, and your mother's screams matched its fury, I wrapped you in silk and handed you to the Queen's most trusted lady, with instructions to hide you far from court, where knives are sharper than in any forest. The revelation struck like a physical blow. This woman had been there at her birth, had been part of the conspiracy to save the Queen's illegitimate daughter, had perhaps been the only one besides her mother who knew the truth. You know who I am, the wild girl whispered. I know what blood runs in your veins, the witch corrected. Royal blood. Blood that gives you claim to a throne currently balanced between a broken king and a murderous schemer. Her gaze sharpened. Blood that makes you both invaluable and deadly to those who play the game of power. The wild girl's head spun with implications, with questions that had no answers. If she was truly Eleanor's daughter, born before the Queen's marriage to Aldrich, then she had no legitimate claim to the throne. Yet her existence alone threatened everything Lady Marianne had built. And if the king discovered her identity, discovered that he'd unwittingly purchased, protected, perhaps even begun to care for the child of his beloved wife. He can never know, she said, the words torn from some deep, wounded place inside her. It would destroy him. Something like approval flickered across the witch's weathered face. Perhaps you understand more than I credited, she murmured, but knowing what should remain hidden doesn't help us now. The poison spreads. Your time dwindles. She turned back to her mortar and pestle, grinding with renewed vigor. And the kingdom teeters on the edge of chaos. What do you mean? While you've lain here these 3 days, fighting for each breath, the world above has fractured. The witch's voice grew grim. The bishop has declared the king compromised by unholy influence. Yours, though they believe you dead. Nobles loyal to the church gather forces in the west. Commoners, starved by poor harvests and heavy taxes, riot in village squares. And through it all, Lady Marianne whispers treason disguised as counsel. The wild girl's chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or something more complicated that had no place in the heart of someone raised in the forest's brutal simplicity. People she'd never met were suffering, dying perhaps, in conflicts she'd unwittingly helped ignite. I need to return, she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. The witch's eyebrows rose. To certain death? The poison. How long do I have? The wild girl interrupted. The old woman studied her with those clouded eyes that somehow saw too much. 2 days. Perhaps 3 if you're stronger than you look. 2 days. 3 at most. Not enough time to flee, to disappear back into the forest she'd once called home. But perhaps enough to set right what had been broken, to expose Lady Marianne's treachery, to save the king from her manipulation, to prevent the kingdom from tearing itself apart. Help me stand, she commanded, forcing steel into her voice despite the tremor in her limbs. The witch made no move to assist. Why go back to those who would destroy you? What loyalty do you owe to a king who bought you like cattle, to a court that shunned you, to a people who fear you? The question struck deep, probing wounds the wild girl hadn't known she carried. Why indeed? She owed these people nothing. The king had purchased her on a whim, had used her as a pawn in his own game of court intrigue. She should hate him, should leave him to the fate he'd created for himself. Yet in the darkness of the witch's den, memories surfaced unbidden. The king's rare, genuine smile when she'd defied his nobles, his confession about Eleanor, raw with grief even after years, the way his hand had lingered on hers, warm and steady, when he'd shown her the secret passage. He was flawed, broken perhaps, but not evil, not like those who plotted around him. Not loyalty, she answered finally. Justice. Something shifted in the witch's expression, respect perhaps, or resignation. Without further argument, she helped the wild girl to her feet, steadying her when her knees threatened to buckle. The poison's cold fingers squeezed her heart with each movement, a constant reminder of the clock ticking down her remaining hours. "If you insist on this foolishness," the witch said, pressing a small leather pouch into her palm, "take this, herbs to slow the poison's progress, to give you a few more precious hours." Her fingers, surprisingly strong, gripped the wild girl's wrist. "But understand this, when the end comes, it will come swiftly. One moment conscious, the next gone. There will be no final words, no dramatic farewells, only darkness." The wild girl nodded, tucking the pouch into the ragged clothes the witch had provided to replace her ruined dress. Death had been her shadow since childhood, in the forest's dangers, in winter's bite, in hunger's constant companionship. She had never feared it, only fought to postpone their inevitable meeting. This time would be no different. "How do I reach the castle without being seen?" she asked, forcing practicality through the fog of pain and determination. The witch's smile was a crack in ancient stone. "The same way I brought you here, through passages older than the kingdom itself." She lifted the oil lamp, its flame guttering in a sudden draft. "Follow me, daughter of Eleanor. Let us see if the blood of queens breeds courage as well as beauty." Hours later, as evening shadows lengthened across Blackmere's weathered stones, the wild girl emerged from a forgotten culvert beneath the castle's eastern wall. Her body ached with each movement, the poison's cold fire running through her veins despite the witch's herbs. She knew she was racing her own death now, a race she was destined to lose. The only question was whether she could accomplish what needed to be done before the inevitable end. The castle seemed transformed in her absence, tension vibrating through its very stones. Guards patrolled in doubled numbers, their faces grim beneath steel helmets. Servants scurried through corridors with downcast eyes, their whispers cutting off abruptly when others approached. Through a kitchen window, she glimpsed preparations for what appeared to be a feast. Roasts turning on spits, pastries being shaped by nervous hands. A celebration, or a distraction from the chaos the witch had described? Using skills honed by years of hunting, she slipped through shadows and forgotten passages, working her way deeper into the castle's heart. Each step was a battle against the poison's advancing grip, each breath shallower than the last. Time was running out faster than she'd anticipated. Finally, she reached the royal wing, its corridors eerily empty of the usual guards and servants. Through a half-open door, voices drifted, one achingly familiar, the other smooth as poisoned honey. "The people need reassurance, Your Majesty," Lady Marianne was saying, her tone a perfect blend of deference and authority. "A strong union would quell these rebellious whispers, would show them that the crown remains unshaken despite recent tragedies." "Tragedies of your making," the king replied, his voice hollow with grief that made the wild girl's chest ache with unexpected sympathy. "How convenient that those who oppose you seem to meet with such unfortunate ends." "I don't know what you mean." Marianne's voice cooled perceptibly. "Don't you?" Something hardened in the king's tone. First Eleanor, then the girl. Now Lord Halford found with a dagger in his back. The same lord who questioned your loyalty at yesterday's council. The wild girl's pulse quickened. The king suspected. Perhaps he had always suspected, had merely lacked proof or courage to act on his suspicions. Until now. "You're distraught with grief," Marianne replied, her voice softening to silk. "The savage's death has affected you more deeply than anyone anticipated, which is precisely why you need someone strong beside you, someone who understands the burdens of rule, who can help shoulder the weight that bends your shoulders." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft clink of what might have been a wine goblet being set down. "Perhaps you're right," the king said finally, his voice unreadable. "Then you'll consider my proposal. A union between us would heal so many wounds, would bring strength where there is now only uncertainty." The wild girl's stomach twisted with revulsion. This was Marianne's endgame, to wed the king, to claim the throne she'd murdered to reach. And from his response it seemed she might succeed. "I'll give you my answer tonight," the king said, "at the feast. Before all the court, you shall have my decision." The sound of approaching footsteps forced the wild girl to retreat, ducking into an alcove as guards marched past. By the time the corridor cleared, both the king and Lady Marianne had gone, leaving her alone with the knowledge that whatever she planned to do, it must happen at tonight's feast, her final opportunity to expose the truth before the poison claimed her. As she slipped away to prepare, one thought burned brighter than the fire in her veins. If these were to be her last hours alive, she would ensure they counted. The silence of the great hall shattered as she entered, fracturing like ice on a spring lake. One by one, heads turned, goblets froze mid-air, and conversations died on parted lips. The wild girl, whom they all believed dead, stood in the massive doorway, her silhouette carved against the torchlight behind her. Blood trickled from her nose, leaving a crimson trail down her chin that she didn't bother to wipe away. Her skin had taken on an alabaster pallor that made her green eyes burn with unnatural intensity, like forest fire glimpsed through morning mist. "Impossible," someone whispered, the word rippling through the gathered nobility like wind through summer wheat. Guards reached for swords, uncertain whether to advance or retreat from this apparent ghost. A serving girl dropped a platter of roasted pheasant, the crash of silver against stone punctuating the moment like a blacksmith's hammer striking final judgment. At the high table, King Aldrich rose slowly from his throne, his face drained of color, his fingers white-knuckled against the carved oak. Beside him, Lady Marianne's perfect features contorted with an emotion far more complex than surprise, rage and calculation warring beneath her mask of shock. Her hand slipped beneath the table, seeking something hidden in the folds of her gown. "Seize her." Bishop Thornfeld's voice cut through the silence, his arm extending like a prophet commanding divine retribution. "This is witchcraft, demonic resurrection." But no guard moved. Perhaps it was fear that rooted them in place, or perhaps it was the wild girl's eyes, those eyes that had seen through forest darkness and court intrigue alike, that now seemed to contain something ancient and terrible as she scanned the room with predatory focus. "I bring truth," she said, her voice carrying despite its newfound hollowness. Each word seemed to cost her physically, her chest rising and falling with labored effort. Truth that some would kill to keep buried. She took one step forward, then another, each movement deliberate despite the tremor in her limbs. The poison was working faster now. She could feel it crawling through her veins like ice, numbing her extremities, squeezing her lungs with ever-tightening fingers. The witch's warning echoed in her mind. When the end comes, it will come swiftly. No final words, only darkness. Not yet. Not until justice was done. "The savage speaks madness," Lady Marianne declared, recovering her composure with practiced grace. She turned to the king, placing a concerned hand on his arm. "Your Majesty, this is clearly some trick, perhaps a twin or an impostor meant to destabilize the crown during this delicate time." Her fingers tightened on his sleeve, nails digging into fabric. "We should remove her before she spreads more chaos." The wild girl reached the center of the hall, close enough now to see the conflicting emotions warring across the king's face. Hope and suspicion, relief and fear. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, had carefully crafted the words that would expose Lady Marianne's treachery while protecting the king from the more devastating truth of her own identity. But standing before him now, with death's cold breath on her neck, all clever speeches abandoned her. "She killed the queen," she said simply, her eyes locked on his. "Your wife. My mother." The words fell into silence like stones into a bottomless well. For one heartbeat, two, the hall remained frozen in collective shock. Then chaos erupted. Lady Marianne's scream of outrage competed with Bishop Thornfeld's shouts of blasphemy, and the rising murmur of noble voices demanding explanation, denial, confirmation. Through it all, the king remained utterly still, his eyes never leaving the wild girl's face. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition dawning like the first light of morning breaking through night's darkest hour. "Eleanor's child," he whispered, the words meant for her alone despite the tumult surrounding them. "They told me you died at birth." A spasm of pain racked the wild girl's body, doubling her over momentarily. Blood dripped from her nose onto the stone floor, each crimson drop marking the time she had left. When she straightened, She found herself surrounded by guards, their swords drawn but held uncertainly, awaiting command from a king who seemed incapable of speech. "Lies." Lady Marianne's voice cut through the chaos. She had regained her footing, her beauty hardening into something reptilian as she addressed the confused gathering. "This wild creature weaves a tale to save herself from justice. Queen Eleanor had no child before her marriage. Everyone knows this." She turned to the king, her tone softening to silk. "Your grief makes you vulnerable to her manipulation, my lord. Remember who has stood by you these 3 years since Eleanor's passing. Remember who has counseled patience, loyalty. Patience while you poisoned his wine." The wild girl interrupted, her voice growing weaker with each word. "Loyalty while you plotted with his enemies." She pulled the queen's letter from within her ragged tunic, holding it aloft with trembling fingers. "Eleanor knew. She wrote this warning before she died, a warning your assassins prevented from reaching the king." Lady Marianne's composure cracked. "Guards! Arrest this impostor immediately! She threatens the crown with these fabrications." The guards hesitated, looking to their king for direction. But Aldrich's attention had fixed on the letter in the wild girl's hand, recognition flaring in his eyes at the sight of handwriting he would know anywhere. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' suppressed grief and dawning fury. "Bring her to me," he commanded, gesturing to the wild girl. "And let no one leave this hall." 2 guards moved to flank her, not as captors, but as supports when her knees threatened to buckle. The poison's advance was accelerating, her vision blurring at the edges as they guided her toward the high table. Behind her, she heard the distinctive rasp of more swords being drawn, the king's personal guard forming a barrier between the nobles and the doors. As she reached the dais, the king descended to meet her, taking the letter from her trembling hand. His eyes scanned the contents, color draining from his face with each line. When he looked up, something had hardened in his expression, the uncertainty replaced by terrible clarity. "How long have I been blind?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Lady Marianne moved with the desperate speed of cornered prey, producing a dagger from her sleeve and lunging toward the wild girl. "Witch! Deceiver!" she hissed, blade flashing in the candlelight. The king's guard intercepted her, disarming her with practiced efficiency, but not before she managed to call out, "Now! Strike now!" At her command, several nobles drew hidden weapons, while others backed away in confusion and alarm. The hall erupted into chaos, guards clashing with armed conspirators, innocent bystanders scrambling for safety, servants fleeing through side doors. The wild girl felt herself fading, the sounds of battle growing distant as the poison tightened its grip. Her legs gave way, and she would have fallen if the king hadn't caught her, lowering her gently to the steps of the dais. His face swam above her, features blurring and reforming as her vision faltered. "Stay with me," he commanded, the authority in his voice unable to mask the desperation beneath. "Guards, find the royal physician immediately." She wanted to tell him it was too late, that the witch had warned her of this moment's inevitability. But speech required breath, and breathing had become a battle she was rapidly losing. Instead, she managed to press Eleanor's letter more firmly into his hand, ensuring the evidence would remain even after she was gone. Through the fog descending over her senses, she became aware of another voice, older, rougher, cutting through the din. The witch had appeared somehow, materializing from the chaos like a spirit summoned by need rather than incantation. She knelt beside the wild girl, her gnarled hands moving with swift purpose as she examined the advancing symptoms. "Nightshade and something else," the old woman muttered. "Something I've not seen before." She turned to the king, who watched with desperate hope. "I need wine, pure honey, and a knife with a silver blade. Quickly." As attendants rushed to comply, the wild girl felt a strange calm settling over her. The battle still raged throughout the hall, but it seemed distant now, unimportant. What mattered was the truth, revealed at last. What mattered was that Aldrich knew that Eleanor's murderer would face justice, that the kingdom might heal from wounds too long festering in secrecy. The witch worked feverishly, mixing substances in a goblet, muttering incantations that might have been medicine or magic or both. The king held the wild girl's hand, his grip fierce as though physical strength alone could anchor her to life. "I would have searched for you," he whispered, his voice raw with regret. "Had I known Eleanor had a child, had I known you existed, I would have turned the kingdom upside down to find you." The wild girl wanted to respond, to tell him that perhaps fate had found a way after all, bringing her to him through the strange path of auction block and royal whim. But the darkness was encroaching rapidly now, her heartbeat faltering as the poison reached its final destination. The witch pressed the goblet to her lips. "Drink, child, quickly." The liquid burned like fire, worse than the poison itself. She choked, body convulsing as it fought both toxin and cure. For one terrible moment, everything went black. Sound, sight, sensation all extinguished as though she'd been plunged into the void between stars. Then, with shocking suddenness, she gasped. A desperate, painful inhalation that felt like breathing for the first time. Color flooded back into the world, sound returning in a rush that overwhelmed her senses. The hall, the battle, the king's face hovering above hers, all snapped back into focus with painful clarity. "She carries royal blood," the witch announced, her clouded eyes fixed on the king with unsettling directness. "Eleanor's daughter, born of youthful indiscretion with a northern lord, hidden to protect the crown, raised wild in the forests beyond your reach." She paused, her next words falling like final judgment. "The very blood that saved her life just now, blood that contains traces of the same poison that took her mother. Immunity built over generations, a family trait." Understanding dawned across the king's features, followed swiftly by horror as he turned toward Lady Marianne, now restrained by guards but still struggling with venomous defiance. "You," he breathed, the single word laden with recognition and revulsion. Not just Eleanor's lady-in-waiting, her half-sister, sharing the same poisoner's blood. Lady Marianne's beautiful face contorted with hatred. She was weak, undeserving of the crown, of you, of everything that should have been mine by right of strength, if not birth. As the guards dragged the struggling woman away, the king turned back to the wild girl, to Eleanor's daughter, who now sat upright, strength returning with each breath. Their eyes met across a gulf of lost years, of parallel lives that should have intersected long ago. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice stronger but carrying new uncertainty. Royal blood or not, she remained what she had always been, a creature of the forest, unsuited to court life and its Byzantine rules. The king considered her question with the weight it deserved. Around them, the hall was being restored to order, conspirators disarmed and arrested, loyal nobles reassuring the frightened. The immediate danger had passed, but larger questions loomed, questions of identity, of belonging, of future paths. "That," he said finally, offering his hand to help her stand, "depends entirely on what you want, not what birth demands, not what court expects, what you choose." For the first time since entering the castle gates, the wild girl felt something unexpected unfurl within her chest. Not the familiar weight of survival's constant burden, but something lighter, something that might, with time, resemble freedom. "I choose truth," she replied, taking his offered hand and rising to stand beside him, not as subject or prisoner, but as equal, whatever comes after. As our tale of the wild girl and the lonely king comes to a close, we're left to ponder the walls we build around ourselves and the unexpected ways fate brings them crashing down. In a world quick to judge and label, how often do we miss the profound connections waiting just beyond our preconceptions? The savage girl, deemed worthless by society, carried royal blood and unmatched courage. The powerful king, surrounded by wealth and power, lived in a prison of grief until truth set them both free. What would you do if faced with such impossible choices? Would you have the courage to trust when every instinct screams danger? Would you risk a crown, a kingdom, perhaps even your life, for the sake of truth? Our characters discovered that true freedom comes not from power or titles, but from the courage to be vulnerable, to shed the masks we wear for protection, and to face the world as we truly are. If this story touched your heart, remember that sharing is another form of truth-telling. Like the wild girl's defiance in the marketplace, your simple act of liking, subscribing, and sharing allows these tales to reach others who might find themselves reflected in these characters. Until our next journey together, remember that even the most unlikely encounters can change not just a kingdom, but a heart.